Jeremy. If you don't know why you're here, well, Google it. This is the first of this season's Culture, Power, Politics seminars, and we're going to be talking about Keir Milburn's book Generation Left, which he's about to introduce. And it's a book, and apologies if people have come to Fan Worship Dawn because she's had to go to a funeral. So.
Can you use the microphone for us?
Oh yeah, all right. Yeah, we'll use the microphone.
Doesn't hear well. Thank you.
Forgot we had it.
If you just stand behind us, usually alright.
I think people might want to talk sitting down. It's maybe we can move it. Like sitting down. That might work. There's a word for you. Is that like shaking?
Hello, it's working.
All right, hello. I couldn't get around to hear from. All right, so apologies, Dawn Foster can't be here because she's had to go to a funeral. I'm going to, I'm not going to talk very long hunched over like this. So we've got Keir Milburn and Lynne Segal, neither of whom probably need much introduction, are going to be talking about some of the themes and issues raised by Keir's new book, Generation Left. I can highly recommend the book if you haven't read it. It's an excellent piece of work in a fantastic series. Definitely recommend every current and forthcoming book in that series. And published the Radical Futures series, published by Polity Press. And I think we're going to start with Keir giving a general account of the arguments he makes in the book, and then, Lynne and myself will respond, and we'll have a wide-ranging discussion. Is that okay? All right. Okay, Keir.
Great, thanks. Is it all right if I sit down? I'm physically not able to stand up. All right. So yeah. So my book, Generation Left, it sort of starts from a particular phenomenon, basically, and it sort of tries to explain this phenomenon, and then by explaining it, we sort of build up a picture of the world as it is, and how it got there, and what we might be able to do about it. And so the phenomenon is this, basically. Over the last few years, age has become the key predictor, the most reliable predictor of somebody's political opinions and the way that they vote. Right? And the general picture is younger people are tending to vote left and adopt left-wing views, and older people are tending to vote right and adopt conservative, social and increasingly political views. So basically what's happened is that there's been a sort of political generation gap that's opened up. The phenomenon is not reducible to electoral politics. It's much wider than electoral politics, but because electoral politics involves polling, it's much easier to see it in that realm. Okay, and so the most obvious place to start is the 2017 general election. There was a statistic that came out just after that, which said that for every 10 years older a voter was, you were 9% more likely to vote Conservative. Labour held a 55 percentage point lead amongst voters who were 18 to 24, so the youngest cohort. The Conservatives had a 40% lead amongst over 65, so perhaps the older cohort that's measured. The tipping point at which you were more likely to vote Conservative than Labour was 47. So people, if you were at 47, you were more likely, or above, you were more likely to vote Conservative than Labour in 2017. But there was some polling done last week. A Conservative think tank has released this sort of panic report and said that that's gone up to 51, basically. So under 50, if you're under 51, you're more likely to vote Labour. This is something which sort of seems obvious in the poll, and there's something going on, right? You may say to me, and many do, you may say to me, look, isn't it just a fact of nature that young people always vote left and older people are always more conservative? There is some sort of trend towards that in the post-war period. But for instance, in the 1983 election, more 18 to 24-year-olds, and in fact more 24 to 30-year-olds, voted Conservative than voted Labour, right, in the 1983 election. So it's not a universal law by any means. And what I'd say is that the scale of this generation gap is much bigger than it's ever been before. The other unusual thing about it is it's opened up very, very quickly. So in the 2010 election, right, the difference in the gap between the voting of the youngest cohort and the oldest cohort was only 10%. Right, there was a 10% gap between the voting of the youngest and the oldest cohort. By 2017, that was up to 97. So it's something that's very, very big, and it's happened very, very quickly. The other thing we should know about it is that it's an international phenomenon. It's not a global phenomenon, right? But it holds true in a very similar pattern in the US, the UK, much of Western Europe. Not true in many Eastern European countries. In Poland, for instance, young people are voting for the far right, you know, in the same proportions as other generations. So it's not a universal phenomenon, but it's something which is international. So in the US, for instance, the place where it was most obviously recognised was in the race for the Democratic nomination for the US presidential election between Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton, and it was basically something like 74% 18 to 24s voting for Sanders, 20% voting for Hillary. Over 65s just swap it and it's exactly the same, 1 or 2 points out. So there's something going on, basically, is my argument. Why? What's gone on? What's caused this? Right? It must have a cause. What's caused this? And I would probably sum up my argument, the argument in my book, of what's caused it is this. There's been a generational divergence in material interests and conceptions of the future, right? So there's been a generation divergence in material interests and in the way generations see the field of social and political possibility, what a viable future might be. Material interests first. I mean, the basic picture is this: there's been just a collapse in the living standards and life prospects of young people. I could give a lot of different statistics about this, about how much more they spend on housing than the previous generation. But like the most obvious and basic statistic is this, right? In the UK and the US, millennials, I don't really like that term, but it's a good shorthand at this point. Millennials will be the first generation who will earn less than the previous 2 generations. So it's the first generation in perhaps 200, 300 years, right, in which the current generation will earn, or millennials will earn less than their parents' generation and less than their grandparents' generation. This is something basically new to contemporary capitalism, not been seen before. Obviously, when something like that happens, it has an effect, right? So that's a prediction, actually, but it's already clear in the evidence now. So a millennial who worked through their 20s would, on average, earn £8,000 less than their parents' generation. Right. So it's a prediction which is already evident in the data. This is a trend that was visible before the financial crisis of 2008. Okay, I mean, we could say one of the ways it gets generated is that neoliberalism and its conditions of work and social reproduction get harsher over time, right? As more and more sort of social democratic compact gets withered away. So if you enter into that system later on in neoliberalism's life, you inherit harsher statistics. So this is something which is a long-term trend, but it's accelerated massively since 2008. Right? Or we could say this in the short run: 2008 is an event which massively constricted or altered social and political possibility. And the way to think about that is this: each iteration of capitalism has a sort of deal, either an explicit deal or an implicit deal attached to it. The neoliberal deal had a very important component, which was aspiration. The idea that over your lifetime, your living standards will increase and you'll have increased access to consumption. That's basically a key part of the deal. That's no longer that no longer seems viable for many people actually, but for young people in particular. And that's a problem, obviously, but it's a problem that gets compounded by this, which is just because an image of the future seems unviable to you doesn't mean you can escape from it, right? Many of the institutions and social relations in which we interact and we are compelled to interact, they're premised on this image of a future, the sort of neoliberal image of the future, that you're going to get a job, you're going to get increased earnings and increased consumption over time. The most obvious example of that is debt, the debt that young people are forced to take on, right? I mean, student debt is the obvious example, but unsecured debt is perhaps an even better example of a compulsion to take on debt from young people. I mean, one way to think of it is that for a while in the post-war period, the state acted as a guarantor of existence, right? A guarantor of social reproduction, right? Through provision of welfare, through housing benefit, state-provided pensions, etc. Increasingly, that's being replaced by the credit card, basically. Access to credit. The credit card is your guarantor that you can still eat and pay your rent when your wages haven't stretched to the end of the month. Like, debt is a very, very strange institution, right? Right. Debt is like it's a contract. You take on this contract, which binds your future self to a decision of your present self, right? You know, you say, I'm going to act. My present self says my future self is going to act in such a way that it's going to pay off this debt into the future, right? We all know that student debt, taking on student debt, replacement of fees by debt, has dramatically altered the kinds of degrees that students do. That's one way in which you get bound, that your present self gets bound by your future self, right? Perhaps sometimes when you take on debt, right, that can seem like it's linked to freedom. I'll take on debt now, then I'll have increased options in the future. Right? The problem is when you take on debt, but the future that is implied in that contract seems unviable to you, that does not seem like freedom. That seems like you're bound, you're trapped in a relationship you can't get out of. You know, you didn't really choose this because there's no other options, and you can't get out of it. I mean, so I think, you know, this is behind a lot of people, young people's feeling trapped, or feeling as though they have a lack of freedom, a lack of control over their lives and their future, etc. One of the best, it was epitomised to me in a placard which was on one of the youth climate strikes that have been taking place recently. Which said, why the fuck should I study for a future that won't exist? That's linked to, you know, climate change, and climate change also has dramatically generational implications. We'll probably talk about that a bit later, I think. I don't focus on that. But you can see why young people would want to vote for something other than what exists now, right? So that's one half of the relation. The other half you have to explain is, well, why are older people tending to vote right? My argument is that in many ways, older generations are trapped on the other side of the debt relationship, right? They're also trapped, but on the other side of that relationship. And to create a picture of how that came about, we need to go back to the 1980s, actually. Right, so I'm going to take you back to the 1980s. So everyone, close your eyes, and I'll paint a picture. Shoulder pads, very big. Shoulder pads in suits, shoulder pads in dresses. Dallas was very popular on TV. Yeah. But the other thing that happened was the unions get smashed, right? The unions get smashed in miners' strike in 1984 and later on the Wapping strike, etc. And basically the picture is this: in the UK, wages have stagnated. Real wages, so adjusted for inflation, have stagnated since the early 1980s or the mid-1980s, right? Capitalism is about growth, 3% growth every year, so that's 3% more things and services that need to be purchased, and a lot of that on a global level was purchased in countries such as the UK. So wages haven't gone up in that time. How do you buy all of this increasing amount of stuff and services? There's various mechanisms. One of them is women going out to work, and so you could have two income streams going into a nuclear family, etc. But the other thing, one of the most major mechanisms, is access to credit. Right? Access to credit and the dynamics that takes on. And so there was a generation through the 80s and 90s, who basically had access to credit primarily through mortgages, but also through the financialisation of pensions, or pensions invested in stocks, etc. Right, and that's where the increase in wealth primarily came from in countries such as the UK. In this way, right, because through this process, the interest, the material interests of that generation, of the older generation, became aligned with the performance of the financial markets, right? Like, the material interest became aligned with keeping house prices high and keeping stock prices high. That's a long-term trend again, but it's massively accelerated since 2008. What have been the government responses to 2008, right? The government responses have been basically this: an ocean of free money has just been chucked at the financial sector, right? A huge amount, trillions and trillions of free money has been chucked at the financial sector through mechanisms such as quantitative easing, taking on bad debts of the banks, etc. Quantitative easing just means you print trillions, you give it for free to the financial sector, and they're going to lend it into, you know, for business investment. But business investment just basically hasn't taken place. What's taken place is that that money has flown into the pockets of the very, very wealthy, and from there it's gone into asset prices. So high house prices haven't fallen in the UK, and sky high stock prices. So by proxy, older generations, those who hold assets, have done okay out of austerity, right? That austerity got paid for by decreased spending, social spending, and constriction on wages, right? So you could see in that relation, in that form of policy environment, you could see why older generations might be voting for more of the same, and younger generations would be voting for anything but this, right? So you can see it sort of makes sense. I'm not saying that everything is rosy for older people, right? In fact, it's not. So a quarter of over 65s in the UK don't own their own home, so they're excluded from this bonanza from the 90s and early 2000s. 1.6 million pensioners in the UK live in poverty. But even those who do own their own home, like, they're caught in a trap. I think many older people see high house prices as their guarantor of care in old age. Right? You cannot rely on the state sector to provide elder care. Right? So how do you do it? Right? You don't have savings generally. You have a house, and you're going to sell that house, and you're going to use that to pay for your elder care. Right? So in many ways, older people have been trapped into this horrible, horrible trap of voting against the interests of their younger relatives, who they obviously love, right? And then there's all sorts of horrendous family dynamics that come into that, as the longer your parents live in care, the more your inheritance whittles down. It's an unpleasant situation for all parties, is my point. So where does that leave us? Well, under the way we normally think about generations, that leaves us in a pretty impossible situation, actually, right? It leaves us we're trapped into sort of generational tension, generational conflict, and actually politically like an impasse, because at the moment, because of the size of the over 65s and the tendency to turn out for elections, there's sort of an impasse, a sort of balance in society where things can't get, the change that needs to happen can't happen. If we keep the way we normally think about generations, there's not an easy solution, there's not an easy way out of that. So I think we need to change the way we think about what a generation is and what generates a generation. Right? The normal way we think about generations is that they're these things that come along every 20 years, right? Get the baby boomers, Generation X, millennials, then the latest one, recently called Generation Z, it's called other things as well, right? There's a problem with this, right? Like, humans as a species, right, we don't just have babies on a 20-year cycle, right? We don't have some sort of like 20-year rutting season where everyone gets together and has sex and all the babies are born. Babies are born each and every day, each and every night, right? It's continuously. Babies are born every day. Right? So there's the problem. Okay, this 20-year cycle. When does one generation start and another generation end? There's not a good answer to that, right? There's not a good answer to that, and we know that because people who use categories such as millennials and Generation Z can't agree when they end and start, right? There's no firm agreement on that. So I think we need to take a step back. You take a step back and say, look, generational differences are not important all the time. In fact, they're only important very rarely, right? They only become one of the key determinants of society very rarely. The last time there was a generation gap was, or a generation gap was one of the things which dominated discussion was back in the 1960s, the early 1970s. And then that generation gap was primarily seen as a gap or a division around cultural values. Younger people had different cultural values to the older generation. I think we can explain that through a particular generation who this definition really suits, right, which is the baby boomer generation, right, who are a very large demographic. And in fact, they're the ones who come closest to this model of like a 20-year rutting cycle. Because the baby boomers come about, they start because the Second World War ends, lots of men come back from war, and lots of sex is had, and lots of babies are born. Then you have, like, you know, post-war mass affluence, and so the level of births stay quite high. They dip a little bit, but they go back up. And then they fall off dramatically in 1965, primarily because the contraceptive pill is introduced, so women gain some sort of control over their own reproduction. My problem is that, so that's that definition of, you know, the definition we use basically fits the baby boomers, but all of the generations after that, like Generation X, Millennials, Generation Z, they're sort of just echoes of this baby boomer generation. Every 20 years, we say there's a new generation come along with no other, just because it's 20 years after the baby boomers, we say new generations come along, even though the generational differences aren't particularly important at that point, right? It's not a concept, as it leaves, it gets further away from the baby boomer generation, it's a concept that loses any coherence, I think. It's going to lose all coherence once baby boomers die. So I would say this, the current generation gap has a totally different character to the generation gap of the 1960s and 1970s. We need a new concept of generations to address it, basically. Where I would start to sort of construct a concept of what a generation is, which suits our present circumstances. I'd go back to, in the book, I go back to the sort of the birth of sociological thinking about generation, which is Karl Mannheim's article, The Problem of Generations, published in 1923. So, and it's useful because Mannheim says, look, you know, generations don't happen sequentially on a 20-year cycle. He says a generation, and he particularly talks about political generation. A political generation, it might only come along once every 100 years, or you might get 2 generations in a decade, right? Because he says what causes a generation, right, or what causes generational differences, which are strong enough to cause, you know, political division. What causes those are moments of very, very rapid change, right? Very, very rapid change, where the normal flow of how knowledge and views change and how we adapt to them, that gets ruptured and broken, right? That gets ruptured and broken, and then you find one generation on one side of this rupture and another generation on the other side of this rupture. Over the last 50 years, there's been lots of theorizing around, in critical theory and so forth, around, you know, these sorts of moments, right? Moments, it's called the event, right? In critical theory, they talk about it as the event. These moments in which the way a society makes sense of itself gets ruptured and broken. Or we might also frame it this way, and you might be able to see where I'm going. Like, you know, an event alters what seems socially and politically possible. It creates a rupture, a really ruptural change in what seems socially and politically possible. And so generations come around when people enter one of these events with very different material resources and psychic resources, or intellectual resources, you might say. So in the book, I sort of read Mannheim through this idea of events and the sort of thinking that's been going on around events. But there's 2 elements to Mannheim's theory. The first one is this, or my version of it is this: it's events that cause generations, right? Events cause generations, or set the conditions that generations can emerge from. The second element of Mannheim's idea is that your experience of these sorts of moments of rapid change are different if you're older or younger. Older people, he says, are less likely to be able to accept the sort of the new problems which emerge out of this rupture in social and political possibility. They're more likely to hang on to the old sense of social and political possibility. And he says the reason we do that is because we tend to interpret new events through our formative events, and our formative events tend to naturalise themselves into a naturalised view of the world. He says younger people tend not to have past experiences because they're younger, and so they tend not to have such a firm naturalised conception of how the world is. And so he says, younger people tend to get a fresh contact with the problems that an event emerges. So look, at the beginning I said, my idea is this, right? There's been a generational divergence around material interests and around the sense of social and political possibilities. You can see how, like, this conception of like events cause generations, that can account for why there might be a divergence of social and political, the sense of what's socially and politically possible, a divergence in the sense of like what possible and viable futures are there out there for us. Right? I've also talked about the divergence in material interests, right? But of course we have a category through which we talk about changing material interests, right? It's called class, right? And in the book I try to sort of think of generational analysis and a class analysis together by murdering a quote from Stuart Hall. And I say, age is currently one of the key modalities through which classes live. Right, Stuart Hall talks about race as being a key modality through which classes live. And we can think about it in terms of this. So, age and the material, the changes in the life prospects around age are one of the ways in which young people are coming to recognise their class position, their changing class position. As I just said, so people's material interests are altering, their view of what the future is going to hold are altering, and that's a way in which they tended to start to see a commonality amongst perhaps graduates and non-graduate young people, basically, who are tending towards ending up in more similar jobs and a similarly precarious positions, right? And we might say on the other side, perhaps older people are tending to see themselves more as asset holders, right, than as retired working people, for instance, right? Of course, generations are fractured by class, and I'm saying that the generational divide is a fracture within class, right? But my point would be something like this: if we just think about generations in terms of age, there's not an easy solution out of it. If we think about generations alongside class and think, alongside class, then the project is to construct a way in which we can avoid this sort of generational conflict, avoid generational tension, and recognise common class interests, basically. I might leave it there. I mean, the last thing I'd say is that, that doesn't explain why young people are going left. And in the book, I sort of talk about there are different types of events, basically. 2008 was an event of a certain kind. It dramatically altered what seemed socially and politically possible by basically cancelling the neoliberal view of the future for young people. Right? But in order for a left generation to emerge, you probably need a different sort of event. In the book I call these moments of excess, moments when, not when possibility closes down, but moments when possibility opens up. And I sort of talk about 2011, the sort of series of movements and revolutions, as one of these classical moments of excess, basically. And so there's a sort of sequence of events which basically starts to form a left political generation around young people. Okay, I'll leave it there. Spoken enough.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Keir. I'm gonna do what I should have done at the start, actually, and introduce Keir properly, just in case anyone doesn't. Then introduce Lynne. I was very flustered because I got here late because I forgot I couldn't just bike over like I usually do. Because I'm going because he's staying at mine after this. I'm not giving him a CT all the way back to Walthamstow. And also because Keir's someone who I'm kind of doing so much sort of collaboration with at the moment. And in my head, I can't for a moment. I don't know how to introduce him. It's Keir Milburn. So Keir's lecturer in organisational. In organisational stuff. Political economy and organisation at Leicester.
I just made that type.
And he's one of the founders and key organisers of Plan C, kind of experimental libertarian communist affinity group and network, and also one of the co-hosts of the ACFM podcast on Novara Media. If you don't subscribe to the Novara feed, then you should. And episode 2 is definitely coming out very soon, and episode 3 is in the can as well. Actually, pretty almost.
Episode 2 on collective joy, which is a favourite subject of Lynne.
Yeah, collective joy. Speaking of which, I'm going to hand over to Lynne Segal. Lynne is Professor of Psychosocial Studies at Birkbeck. I got that right, didn't I?
Okay.
And isn't that right?
I am in that department, yeah.
You're
No, that's fine, that's fine.
I really should. I should have this stuff memorised. Lynne's the author of many books, and a very important body of work, which recently has covered topics including collective joy and the politics and experience of ageing. Lynne is, Lynne is a sort of is a sort of hero of the New Left, and has been a hero of the sort of libertarian left in Britain, I think, since the 1980s, since the late 1970s actually, and. One of the first, I think the first thing I ever read in like a proper grown-up journal was an article you wrote in New Left Review in like 1987 or something. I was really pleased with myself. And an influence on us all ever since. So I'm gonna ask Lynne to respond in whatever way, and then I'll make some remarks and then we'll open it up. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Jeremy. Well, I forgot my Zimmer frame, but I represent the wicked baby boomers, that older generation, supposedly responsible for so many of our woes today, and especially actually since 2008. Is it clear? You can hear me? It's almost been normalised to blame the baby boomers. It was, we have been declared the selfish, greedy generation, even bizarrely presented by certain economists in the Times as responsible for the economic downturn of 2008. The then Tory cabinet minister, David Willett, was one of the big orchestrators of all this, publishing a book with the tendentious title, The Pitch, How the Baby Boomers Took Their Children's Future Away, and why they should give it back. So this was serious stuff. It was happening all the time, soon after the economic crisis, to target us, target my generation, and such vilification neatly joined two conservative mantras. First of all, trashing the radical politics of the 60s and early 70s, while simultaneously disparaging those now in need of more welfare support, those who were becoming more fragile and who, having paid into their pensions for the last 40 years, were entitled to get one. So one key feature of the attack on my generation, now wickedly living longer, you think we might be celebrating, but oh no, now living longer, was of course to justify the austerity measures and further curbs in public spending. We were a demographic time bomb, and that was in fiction. It was all over the place. The tsunami, the silver tsunami that's about to attack us all, with one US investment banker doubling as pundits as they do, claiming that old age was now one of the greatest social hazards facing the developed world in the 21st century and might destroy democracy itself. But now, taking over from the right, we are now being attacked from the left, but we'll go more into that. We are guilty, guilty all over again. We oldies, as Keir rightly notes, have not been voting the right way. Well, some of us have not been voting the right way. It's the over 65s who have been keeping the right in power. In 2017, Keir just told us this, 54% of the youth voted Labour, but only 35% of the over 65s. And although it's rising, the statistics are changing, and you'll have to do the maths, because on one figure you said there was a 97% gap between the young and the old. I can't quite imagine how we get the 97% gap on that, but my maths are no good. Anyway, of course, then we know this is one trigger for Keir's thoughts on the birth of Generation Left, those 54% voting for Labour, among other things. Seeing a new army of youth, the 18 to 24-year-olds, who finally, after all these years, are at last seeing through market illusions, especially after the last 10 years of what Keir refers to as zombie neoliberal capitalism, a time when everyone is still going through all the motions of pretending if they work even harder they might do better, but actually nobody is doing better apart from the 1% right at the top. So so Keir is nothing if not nuanced, and as we heard from the end of his presentation, he has a lot to say about generations and what forms them, though I think one can never be quite nuanced enough. For a start, he knows how tricky any concept of political generations are, with their elastic borders at either end. Moreover, there has to be some dramatic narrative, again he says, to tell the story of a generation. So we baby boomers had two dramatic narratives. We were born just after the Second World War, during or after, so that was rather dramatic, but we were born into the golden age of capitalism, a massive consumer expansion when wages were rising, welfare was increasing, public housing was being built. Imagine all these things. We unquestionably were a lucky generation. But whatever that story, it's still the case, actually, that there's not so much change in the poverty of old people. It's actually still the case that over 15% of old people are living in poverty, and as Keir said, a quarter of old people don't own their own houses. So, there's one story, and then there's the other story to tell, particularly once we factor in class, race, and all the other hierarchies of power. But as Keir says, what is unquestionable is how relatively worse off overall are most young adults today on almost any index at all of financial well-being compared to my generation, born into the effects of decades of neoliberal policies, which, as he said, get worse and worse every decade. We've had 40 years of it, with the resulting escalating inequality. Coming of age in the 21st century leaves most young people saddled with debt, paying for higher education, working in insecure jobs for lower wages, and with acute housing problems. So to take just one example that he gives, for my generation in the 1970s, we spent between 5 to 10% of our money on housing. Now, that has tripled, and at least a third, for some people, about half of their income is going on housing when they can manage to get it, very insecure housing at that, with lives dominated by rent and the need for endless toil for what he rightly calls generation rent. So that's not surprising that it should lead to a huge difference in outlook for young and old alike. The strange thing is, of course, when I think of the old, I can't connect with the old who are voting Tory. I don't know them. I haven't met them, so I have to talk about the wide fraction of oldies and the significance of our existence in the world. So for my fraction of oldies, what was so significant about those of us who were engaged in radical politics, as very many of us, well, a significant number of us were, was how hopeful we were, the huge hopes and the real global solidarity that existed in the politics of the 60s and 70s, fighting for an end to war, first up Vietnam, to colonialism, first up anti-apartheid, aiming for radical social equality, and all my old friends will still be penning that radical social equality, when a working class hero was something to be, but quickly we saw this working class hero always tended to be male, to be white, and to be British, though certainly not rich or posh. Contempt alone would greet anyone coming from Eton or Worcester or any other public school, unless he happened to be running a New Left Review or something like that.
It still is.
So this is why women, black people and sexual dissidents of all stripes soon came to join the movement in the 70s, a genuine freedom movement. We were in this together, whatever our very real squabbles and differences, very real indeed. The fight for equality and recognition must be for all or not at all, and could be won. Indeed, we did win many things for women, anti-racist legislation. Many things were won in the 1970s. That's why we got neoliberalism. That's what the following decades were all about. So that coming of age, a mere 20 years later, as our children did, as my son did, was coming into a completely different mindset, because that had been the struggle which Keir describes, the struggle of neoliberalism in its confrontational first few decades, when they were determined, as Thatcher said, to change hearts and minds. That's what we want to do. Even all the economic changes, all the policies, they were all to change our hearts and minds about what was possible. So, what our hearts and minds would be changed towards was to reject collectivism that was declared crusty and boring, no such thing as society, only individuals and families, and the popular media ramped up the competitive nature of every aspect of life. Winner takes all, loser be damned. There were so many iconic defeats in the 1980s. Segal and the miners in 1985, Livingston's GLC dismantled the following year, public housing sold off at an increasingly rapid rate, trade unions and local councils anywhere where people could gather for collective action. That was what was targeted for cuts and closed down as spaces for people to be in. The anarchic offbeat humour of the young one and radical comedians who were then still very much around from the 70s into the early 80s was soon replaced by the streamlined competitive formats of winners and losers that are still with us, with audiences participating in the grading of who's to win, who's to lose. Hyper-competitiveness was the ever more monotonous formula in game shows such as Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Who wants to be a millionaire? I've no idea. Launched in the late 90s, and by 2000 we had Anne Robinson's On the Missing Link, ridiculing failure, you're the missing link. And endless other popular competitions such as Big Brother, The Apprentice and all. I've not seen them, but endless others. You're out, one winner only, you see. So by this time, as Keir mentions, neoliberal ideology is floating high. It's been normalised, reigning supreme, and any resistance to the competitive outlooks of the supposedly free market, which of course obviously is not remotely free because it's ever more oligopolized corporations who were knocking out any other markets, but anyway, the supposedly free markets, is now deemed absurd in what Keir nicely summarizes as consciousness deflation. You didn't mention consciousness deflation. I thought that was quite nice as an alternative term to what we were doing in the 1970s, which was consciousness rising, which was our own problems or the problems we saw of others around us, near and far, were never simply individual problems. They were always collective problems. They were always political problems. So consciousness raising, pioneered by feminism, was, what was the basis of politics, to collectivize everyone. No one is simply an isolated individual. That's what my generation, as I understood it and understand it still, stood for and stands for. But then we had the financial collapse of 2008, another defining moment, as many see it, though it took a few years for it to actually be defined or definitive, or to transform anything decisively. At first it merely seemed a time of ever-heightening punitiveness and comprehensively more austerity policies, as here in the UK, the Tory-led coalition government proceeded to bail out and reward the bankers and unregulated corporations, becoming even more unregulated, that had caused the financial collapse, while pushing a narrative blaming those who suffered most from the banking collapse for being the cause of it. So that's where us oldies come in, but of course, not only the oldies, very quickly it would be the single mothers, very quickly it would be anyone, actually, dependent on welfare, apart from the welfare that was used to bail out the banks, of course, or to set up businesses. So this is the zombie capitalism that Keir mentions, where we all keep ticking over and doing what we're meant to be doing, but increasingly we can see, or some seem to be, more seem to be able to see, we're going nowhere. I think Keir borrows this notion from Mark Fisher, who also was a very influential person before his tragic death a few years ago, writing about capitalist realism. So this then is the background to another definitive event, seen symbolically as kicking off with the Arab Spring of 2010-2011, which did briefly have dramatic consequences, especially, of course, getting rid of Mubarak in Egypt. Sadly, they've got someone just as bad or probably worse now. But it was an amazing moment. Things will never be the same. And so people really thought so. So many women's voices, so many, old and young, in the squares at that time. So hopeful, and that also mushroomed into dramatic action elsewhere. Occupy Wall Street in New York, where for 2 months they camped out in Zuccotti Park, and others around the world. Even here in Britain, in St. Paul's, there were tents set up occupying St. Paul's. What would Jesus do was the squatters penned provocatively, knowing that Christianity's founding Jewish rebel and prophet was no friend to moneylenders and cared deeply about the poor and the sick and the discarded and the destitute. So Jesus came to our side briefly. What was finally being seen then was the harsh austerity regimes imposed by governments to refinance the banks had actually caused nothing but this distribution upwards, which Keir says was more of a distribution upwards than almost ever in human history. So I forgot the exact phrase, into the pockets of the 1%. Now, in fact, the first prolonged occupations of urban spaces began with the massive street protests in Athens some years earlier, the harsh effects of austerity there in 2008. These protests were supported by the new then radical left party Syriza, formed as a coalition of radical left groups which would eventually be voted into government in 2015. And you didn't say so much about the electoral turn, did you? Which I thought was very significant in the book. The Greek resistance was soon followed by mobilizations in other parts of southern Europe facing similar austerity measures and spiraling unemployment, especially youth unemployment in Spain. The indignados, as they were soon called, occupied Spanish squares in their millions in the summer of 2011, many soon putting their energies into political formations capable of contesting elections, in particular the founding of the left populist party, Podemos. Similarly, in Portugal, hundreds of thousands of protesters